I want you to think about what the word nature means to you, and just what nature itself means to you. Just take a moment, just quietly to yourself, and just think about that. One of the things for me has been silence in nature, other than the birds and the wind and the water. So if you're not muted, you might want to mute yourself just in case, and in case the dog starts barking, which is actually our pets are one of the easiest ways to get reconnected with nature, because I don't know how many of you enjoy your pets by the fire, or when they sit in your lap, or I mean, what's really happening when that's occurring. I know you love your pets and they're wonderful creatures, but you're really connecting with another species in a way that taps into, I kind of like to refer to as atavistic tendencies. That harkens back to your genetic past when the wolf was sitting next to the fire. And that's really the closest connection we have with nature. And then once you figure that out, you get a bonding with other species in a way that it's a lot easier than just taking a walk at some point. So nature for me means a lot of different things. We've got huge forests, and this is the lodgepole pine forest in Yellowstone. This is a forest up in Northern California. I think it's the northernmost stand of sequoias up in this area. It's in the Tahoe National Forest. And I don't know what you feel like when you see this or the last picture, but I see a beautiful habitat. Some people will look at this and see only one thing, and that's fuel. And there's an orientation that you have in life based upon your past or your career or what you've learned. And it really shapes how you think about things and how you see things. But for me, this is a beautiful habitat. And so is this. This is a post-fire habitat. This is after the Rimfire. And this whole area has a large number of older snags, which are dead trees, which provide tremendous habitat for beetles and then the associated birds that are going to come after them. And all those little trees you see under there, you've got conifers and firs and lots of little herbaceous plants. This is an incredibly healthy post-fire habitat. And again, a lot of folks look at this and see an unhealthy clogged forest with a bunch of dead sticks. And that's a human perspective. It's not necessarily one that nature would see if she could. Here's a close-up of that little scene. This is in a wetland meadow, like I said, during the Rimfire, about 6 years after the fact. And then my favorite habitat is Chaparral, which covers thousands of acres over many areas in California. Its natural condition is thousands and thousands of acres of impenetrable shrublands. and they explode and flower sometimes if they're dominated by a particular shrub like ceanothus, which is what you see here. And again, I see this as a beautiful thing. It's one of California's most precious natural resources, but others may not see it that way. And this is what we're going to talk about today. What's been happening in the press and rhetoric from politicians is they're really normalizing the destruction of habitat. And by doing so, they're really destroying the essence of what makes California so wonderful. And when I say normalizing, they don't call nature nature anymore. It's fuel. It's brush. It's something other than what it really is. And as you all know, when you want to marginalize a group or a thing, you come up with sort of Orwellian terms, don't you, to minimize the thing or the group of people. This is a huge Doug fir that was killed probably in the late 1800s, that has slowly rotted away, because as you probably know, most of the big trees in California have long since been cut down. And so a lot of the trees around what you see, obviously they grew up in the last century. And this is a fuel treatment area in the Stanislaus National Forest. And again, the word treatment sounds like there's some kind of disease there. And so people start thinking in those terms. you get these mastication projects where they go in and they want to create this sort of mythical park-like forest. And everyone's happy now. It's a safe fire zone. This isn't a habitat anymore. There's nothing really alive here that's of any consequence. And I know things will come back, but that's not what they want. They don't want the things to come back. This is what they want in a lot of these forests. When I say they, I'm talking about a lot of folks in the fire service, in the Forest Service, and people who really feel that we need to get into forests and fix them. And chaparral's part of this problem too for people. They don't like the shrubs under the trees because, again, they're not shrubs, they're ladder fuels. It's another sort of Orwellian term. This is an old growth manzanita that is one of my most favorite plants out there. And I don't know how you feel when you see this picture, but it doesn't make me feel very good. And these giant grinding machines they throw out there, this is what we do to remove all the overgrown forests and the overforestation and the dense shrublands and the overgrown brush. And these are terms that are good for your yard, maybe your closet you haven't cleaned out for 10 years, but this is not what goes on in nature. You can't have an overgrown natural landscape. I mean, regardless of what people want to say. You can have a damaged landscape that's coming back in a weird way, but overgrown is an anthropogenic term that's not particularly useful. So, they'll go out and again, I'm talking about people who promote these ideas of the need to clear habitat, and they'll do things that will, mitigate, they say, the damage. So if you look in the background here between that lone manzanita shrub on the right, and there's another one there on the left, before you get to the trees, there's sort of a shrub area. That's a wood rat nest that they mowed around to mitigate any damage to the wood rat. Well, I mean, I don't know where they learned their biology, but that wood rat nest is not going to be functional anymore. It's going to overheat and the wood rat's going to be gone. Those two manzanitas they left because they figured, well, we'll just, we'll create these little legacy islands of manzanitas. They all end up dying because the soil's been disrupted and the climate in and around the shrub just isn't conducive to its continued growth. Interestingly enough, the Whittier fire, this is above the ridge of above Goleta in Santa Barbara. The Whittier fire burned through this. Now, that's a tree plantation you see in the background there. They put this fuel break in to presumably, control the fire. Well, the Whittier fire came through, it jumped the fuel break and almost went to the ocean. This is a thing that happens all the time. And then what happens afterwards, there's the remains of the tree plantation, is it gets filled with weeds now, and now you've got a more flammable condition than you had in the first place. So there's this sort of disconnect between what they think they're doing and what's actually happening. And frankly, all of these projects, no matter how they want to characterize them, are compromising the natural environments that are there and often making the fire risk worse. So there's a bunch of things you hear all the time, specifically fire suppression. And I'm going to go through three of these that you hear that justify all of these efforts to go and clean up nature. This is a map of all the forests in California. I'm going to overlay another map. Those are all the fires, all the treatments, all the prescribed burns in forests in California. And if you take a look, there's not a lot of forest left that hasn't been somehow managed or clear cut or burned. So about 63% at least of all the forests, the low elevation forests in California burned or have been logged since 1950. So that's not a century or more of fire suppression problem. That's almost a century of nature suppression. So this fire suppression story, it might have been true 35, 40 years ago, but it's not true anymore. And it's especially true if you think about fire throughout the entire state. And take a look at this map. So much of the landscape is burned now that this fire suppression story is moot. It really is. But they keep using it in a way to promote their policies. And we've got to turn the conversation around to look at actually what's happening on the landscape. We don't have a fire suppressed landscape anymore, except maybe in a couple other areas in some forested places. And even that's not really the issue. It's a legacy of past logging is really the issue. Another thing you may hear about is dead trees and forests in particular. Here's a map of the most deadliest fires in that period of devastating fires, 2017, 2018. In terms of dead trees, this is an overlay. And the hotter the color, the more dead trees supposedly there are. You'll notice the fires aren't where the dead trees are. So you say, well, just wait. Okay, well, here's a map of all the fires that were devastating, and I define those as at least 500 structures lost and 1 or more fatalities since the Oakland Hills fire in 1991. Dead trees have had nothing to do with these fires. In fact, most fires had nothing to do with forests at all. And if you look at the Ferguson fire there, that was in a dead tree patch. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And you hear comments from some people that actually should know better. They're fire scientists saying that these dead trees are going to cause a Dresden type firestorm of catastrophic proportions. It doesn't happen on the landscape. So where's all the money going? All the homes are burning and the people are dying nowhere near most of these forests. So you probably know the answer, but we'll get to that in a moment. So here's a picture of that trailer park in Paradise. And you'll see the forest around it had nothing to do with the devastation of the trailer park. Yet what's the answer? Well, we need to cut down the trees. Well, okay, I think we're looking in the wrong direction. And just talking about the fire in particular, the Campfire. The Campfire is actually a wonderful example, if you want to use that word, of what's wrong with this fire suppression, nature suppression story. So the fire started over there by Pulga. This entire area had burned 10 years before the Campfire, all right? So it was already young vegetation. So all those stories about fire suppression and clogged landscape didn't even apply here, right? And so the fire went racing toward Paradise through not only young vegetation, which people will say young fuels, which I don't want to use that term. But anyway, it went through not only that, but a lot of this area had been salvage logged and replanted as tree plantations or tree farms, which contributed to the intensity of the fire. And they did the salvage logging in these areas predicated on how it would reduce fire risk. In fact, what it did, it increased it. And I don't know where the lawyers are in this, but somebody ought to look into exactly why that town was destroyed in the manner it was, because it ignited before the fire got there. It was all about embers. And so, you know, the story you're hearing here is not complete. In fact, the fire moved so fast, had there been a forest actually there, it would have slowed down a little bit and would have given the people in Paradise a little more time to evacuate. The whole thing was a disaster, but the response we've had is, well, let's clear more habitat. Well, you already had, you know, a cleared habitat in the first place there, and it didn't work. So this fire had to go across about 6 miles and 30,000 acres of 10-year-old vegetation before it impacted the town of Paradise. So the story you're hearing about how to reduce fire risk doesn't really pencil out in this situation. So just quickly, and then I'll pause for a moment. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is how fires work, and this is how homes burn. So a fire front will come through, and this is what everybody keeps talking about. You know, these 100-foot flame lengths, and we've got to keep the flames away from, you know, the communities. That's not the problem. Here's the problem. These embers travel a mile or more from the fire front, and that's what ignites the homes. And the research has made this clear over and over again. Homes get burned by embers. This is a study in the Woods Creek fire down here in 2007. Excuse me, 2008. No, it was 2007. There just weren't any homes ignited by direct flame contact. So what message do we keep getting? We have to have defensible space. It doesn't matter. and that's the only message we heard. I heard a public message yesterday on the radio from Cal Fire. Make sure you get your defensible space. I've got friends and neighbors and people I've talked to who cleared 300 feet. I don't understand, my house burned down, because the message isn't coming across, which is what people need to hear. It's not about flames, it's about the embers. Okay, I'll pause there for a moment. Does anybody have any questions you'd like to ask? Just unmute yourself if you like, and go ahead and ask.
Rick?
Yes.
This is Nan asking you this question.
Sure.
So defensible space, does that have to do with keeping fire from approaching your house, or is it about giving room to the firefighters who will protect your house or supposedly protect your house should it catch fire?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nan. So yes, a lot of it has to do with protecting firefighters who will come and defend your house, and that's why it's called defensible space, right?
That's
but
what I was
the reality is, in these wind-driven fires, there's the chance that you're going to have an engine in front of your house is next to nil. And this has been repeated over and over and over. And yes, you know, they'll pass a house that's got vegetation up to the walls, you know, and let it go. I mean, they're not going to put their lives at risk. But you know, what we're really looking at here is massive loss of property and what's occurring there. You know, Coffee Park, which burned in the Tubbs fire, I mean, it was these little 1,500 square foot homes, suburbia, 5 miles away from any vegetation, frankly, you know, and they had the 101 between it and the fire. This is the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa in 2018, I think, 17.
If I can make a comment.
Yeah, sure.
This is Rick Coates. I'm the other Rick. I'm executive director of Forest Unlimited, and my daughter lived right on the edge of the Tubbs fire, almost lost her. And you're absolutely right. There was no forest in sight. It was the Embers. I, on the other hand, live in the middle of the forest, and I do believe in a defensible space. But I also think that the Embers are the problem, and it's not the trees, it's the houses where often the fires start with home fires and with electrical connections. And it's also the logging practices. So fire follows logging like night follows day. That's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. You know, the big fires in the big, what do they call it? The big burn, 1910 or something. You know, a lot of that was exactly what you're saying, was powered by the logging slash that the companies had left around. But also, which is what we're going to talk about in a moment too, a lot of it had to do with the climate and the dryness and the drought that they were experiencing back then.
Rick, could I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Judy Villablanca, and I live in Malibu. We've been emailing back and forth. So I attended a public meeting last night on Malibu's, draft community wildfire plan. And many of us reacted to the plan. Just the context of the plan was, I think, exactly what you're talking about. Chaparral is evil. Chaparral is a fuel source. And it was brought up a number of times, that the defensible space is based on what the firemen need. And, God bless our firemen, they're amazing. And I would not want to put them in harm's way. But I don't think you're going to fight that 100 feet clearance space. I mean, it's codified like in city and state and everything. Yeah. And I just think but I think put it this way, if you could keep it to the 100 feet of reasonable defensible space and work on hardening homes. But it's really hard to counteract that. Listening to the comments last night, and Malibu is completely traumatized, because of the Woolsey fire. And we had such horrific losses, including 80% of the native habitat in the Santa Monica Mountain Recreation Area, which horrified me as much as the home loss. It's just, and you sit at these community meetings and I bring up all the points on your side that we've talked about, and they say, well, that's a really, to one side opinion, and, we have to think about the firefighters, and we still need to do this 100-foot defensible space. And worse yet, I don't know if this is true in your other areas, but like our planning department here, you're allowed to have certain size development on a lot. And then from that structure, you have to have this 100 feet clearance. Well, you're not supposed to take ESHA, right? But if the house is this 11,000 square foot house and it means taking ESHA for the fire clearance, they always give a variance. And so here you've got ESHA being destroyed on every part. So how do we combat this? Like, I'm really struggling with the tools I need as a citizen to, to come to these meetings and comment on these plans and say, this is horrible.
Yeah, well, let me just jump in on that specifically. I don't want to leave the impression that I don't think 100 feet of a defensible space is important. It's critical. It's part of the fire risk reduction equation. So I'm not talking about not doing it. I'm just saying that it's not sufficient, and the focus on it doesn't help. So
necessary, insufficient. That's the
that's the point. So you do need 100 feet of defensible space around homes, around communities, and that's been scientifically shown to help. There's no question about it. Now, how you do it is a different thing, which is another topic. But clear dirt is a disaster because it creates a bowling alley for embers, and it targets homes all the time. And it actually creates more embers, and it creates a speed factor because of the physics in these wind-driven events that you're actually increasing the risk of your home igniting. Now, if you put the proper vegetation in there to break down the wind, it has a significant difference in reducing the ember flow. So anyway, but the point is here, this focus on vegetation, this almost myopic view is causing problems, and it prevents us from really addressing the real issue. But defensible space, again, it's important.
Defensible space, the other big issue is it costs a lot of money. We just installed these fabulous ember-proof vents on our house. And if you have I've seen, like in the Woolsey fire, there were 6 homes in a row that got lost, and the modern home that was all stucco glass had coastal oaks around it, no vegetation on the house, great vents, didn't burn. And that's expensive. And if you look in Malibu, again, I'm sure it's true in Paradise, the older homes that have, roofs that aren't optimal, a lot of wood things around, don't have good vents. It costs a lot of money to do that.
That's why I'm going to talk about the governor's budget for a minute, and there's ways to get around that. But you're right. Let me just talk about fire severity really quick.
Rick?
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting, but the statement you made about what had the bowling alley effect.
Yes.
Could you give a written statement, because just for me to use, because and of course I don't have to attribute it, but I would if you to the county ag, because they're clearing several hundred feet in 2 directions from my house because it's undeveloped, and they keep coming up with that. So what I want to tell them is that they are increasing my risk, and maybe that will get their attention.
Yeah, if you go to our website, go to the fire tab, and it goes and it drops down and it says protecting your home. There's a whole statement there, and there's a paper that's actually a peer-reviewed paper that talks about it, so you can use that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, let me talk about fire severity. So we talked about this fire suppression thing. Everybody talks about these unnaturally high severity fires. So this is a map of the Ferguson fire. If you remember, that's the one that was in the forest that was on my map with the dead trees. It had a whole bunch of dead trees. And here's a close-up map of the dead trees in that fire. Now just take a look at the severity map. The red zones in the map show where the fire burned the most severe. And what that means is it killed the most plant material or trees. Well, you take a look where the dead trees are in the second map and take a look at the fire severity map. There, there's not a lot of correlation there. In fact, the Ferguson fire in the middle of the most dense dead tree patch burned pretty naturally. And so this is the kind of fire you want. The issue is, I think what's happening is, people don't want fires, period, except the fires they light themselves with drip torches, maybe. So any kind of big fire is bad. But in fact, it's really our only hope in the forest anyway of resetting the system from all the logging damage. Chaparral's different. Talk about that in a moment too. But just take a look at the points here that that are so contrary to what you're hearing. And here's a map of the Rimfire, which you hear about all the time, how it's a horrible fire. And that picture I showed you in the beginning of the forest regenerating, you know, the Forest Service says that's not happening. Well, it is regenerating. You see a lot of red here in the Rimfire. What I want to point out, though, is most of the red are highly logged, clear-cut areas that were damaged before the fire. Here's an overlay of the Rimfire area. It shows all of the previous fires. So we've got some background noise there. If you could mute yourself, that would be wonderful.
Not hot. Oh, we don't have hot water.
We do have.
Yeah, Catherine?
A little bit of pressure.
Rick, just mute everybody, Rick.
Okay, I think we got it. Thank you. All right. Thanks, Nan.
The fire that burned into Yosemite.
Yeah, so if you take a look at this, those hot areas were up in the clear-cut area. Let me go back for a second. That area between the two words clear-cut, that is where the red zone is. It's also an inholding from, I think it's Sierra Pacific Industries. And so if you look at this, we're not talking about a fire suppressed landscape at all. We're talking about, you know, an area that's been burned multiple times plus been logged. So if you go back again, a lot of these really bad burned areas in red are a result of the logging, not any kind of fire suppression dynamic. Okay, so the second point here I want to bring up is that what's causing these big fires? Well, it's really about climate, not what's burning. And people have got to get that in their mind, and it's counterintuitive. Yes, I know you need something to burn to have a fire. Yes, if you have more stuff to burn, it's more intense and it's bigger. But the question is, why don't you have these high severity fires in Minnesota? or you know, because it's too wet. Things don't burn unless they're dry. Now, usually when they talk about how much fire there's been over the last, you know, couple decades, they like to show the chart on the right, acres burned over time. And they always start around 1980. And this only goes to about 2015. So there's more bars on the right that are higher. But the point is, what's happening is the climate's drying, and that allows the landscape to be more flammable and you get bigger fires. So PDO is short for Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's basically the warming and cooling of the Pacific Ocean. If you take a look at the whole century, we had a whole raft of fires in the early part of the 1900s. And it wasn't because of fire suppression or unnatural amounts of vegetation or overforesting. It was because it was dry. And then it cooled off, and look what happened to the amount of area that was burned. It went down. And guess what's happening now? It's going back up again. Why? Because of the climate. So it doesn't matter what kind of vegetation you've got. It's about the climate. And there's a recent study that's been done, I'm going to overlay it here, talking about the vapor percentage deficit. What this means is how much water can you put in the air as opposed to how much water is in the air. And so when there's not a lot of water in the air, there's a deficit. And so this black and green line, what it's showing you over the same time period is when it's wet and when it's dry. Well, as you go up, that means there's a deficit of moisture in the air. And take a look at how this graph compares to the last one. And look what's happening since 1980. We're going off the charts in terms of dryness in the western states. And that's why we've got big fires. It has nothing to do with past fire suppression. It has nothing to do with population. It has nothing to do with any of the things you hear about. It's about the weather. And so people will say, well, we can't control the weather, but we can't control the fuel. Well, it doesn't matter whether it's grass, shrubs, trees, dense or not, or houses. when you've got these conditions, you're going to have huge mega fires. And so what you've got to realize, how do we protect ourselves from these things? And you don't do it by destroying the natural environment. You do it by retrofitting the homes and stop putting people in harm's way. So let me just talk about Chaparral in particular, which is my favorite thing, just to give you a perspective. That's what it is. It's this is in Santa Barbara. It's really gorgeous. This is about a 50-year-old stand, which we define as old growth Chaparral. And if you look at a map here, it's everywhere. I think the only county it's not in is in Sacramento, but it was probably there at one point. Unfortunately, increasing fire frequency does this to Chaparral. It converts it to non-native weed lots. And before I, elaborate on that anymore, type conversion is not Chaparral to weeds. All right, it's Chaparral to something else, to something else, to something else. Typically, what happens when fires increase, and what I'm talking about more than once every 30 years between fires, you start losing particular species like ceanothus, some manzanitas, and you lose the biodiversity over time. And you may be looking at a Chaparral stand that has shrubs and ceanothus blooming, and you say, gosh, it's awfully beautiful. Well, it is, but it's got half the biodiversity that it had since the last fire, because there's been too many fires over the last 20 or 30 years, until finally it's had it and it turns into this. So this is the end point. And so Cal-Fire is trying to wiggle around the fact, well, we're not going to convert this to weeds and type convert. We're going to just thin it out and we'll still have Chaparral. Well, no, you don't. It's a different habitat completely. And I don't like to get too down and out about this, but this is the state prediction of what's going to happen with landscapes in California over the next century. And this is a map showing the areas suitable for Chaparral. And you'll notice where the red is. Within 100 years, that's where Chaparral is probably not going to exist anymore, based on climate change. And that's exactly where it is today. And just to let you know how disconnected Cal-Fire and the governor is on all of this, this is a map that's going to be overlaid on this, showing you what they want to do between now and next decade to take care of this fire problem. Those marks, the purple and the kind of tannish green, those are areas Cal-Fire is going to go quote unquote treat. Okay, let's go back. This is where the Chaparral's left. And this is where it's endangered. And guess what they're doing? They're going to burn it and go and masticate it or herbicide it, because they feel, well, if it's over 30 years, it needs to be restored because it hasn't had enough fire. What they're doing, they're artificially adding more fire, more disturbance to a system that's already threatened. It's going to end up disappearing because of climate change if we continue in the trajectory we're going. So this is the issue that we're fighting, and that's why we've taken Cal-Fire to court on their vegetation treatment program. So before I jump on sort of what actually is happening, anybody have any quick questions about what I just showed you?
I do. This is Ava.
Hi, Ava.
So why is the California government so opposed to what the right solution is? I still don't understand why that's happening.
You often beat your head against the wall wondering why don't they understand me? You know,
right.
I don't know, but what I can tell you is I think it's a fair assumption to say a lot of politics and policy is driven by financial interests and lobbying efforts by people who are going to be able to either lose money or make money on particular things. And in my mind, there's really no question as to why there's so much money focused on forests, because that's the timber industry and the biomass industry lobbying the halls every day. There's nobody up there, except for a few nonprofits, that are lobbying for homes and families that have lost their homes in fires. I mean, because there's no money to be made. And I'll give you a quick story. After the 1930, I think it's 1936 or something, 5 or 38 fire in Berkeley Hills, they passed an ordinance there that outlawed shake shingles. That ordinance lasted 6 months. And why was that? Because the shake shingle industry lobbied against it. Well, you probably know now I think it's almost impossible to use shake shingles on your house because it's against code, right? Do you know why the code is there?
Mhm.
And you think, well, because it's not safe, right? No, because there's no shake shingle industry anymore. And I don't want to be cynical about this, but this is what we have to confront. Is a lot of these responses and policies, are not necessarily driven by what's right or what works, but who's got the loudest voice. And I do believe, politics is like the stock market. Eventually things will get better, but there's a lot of these ups and downs that make no sense at all. And we're in one of those troughs, I think. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly comment on that. Ava, if you want, I made a summary last year or so about the relationship between California / forestry and money spent. So yeah, if you want, I can send you that. And because it was complicated for me, but I think when you think that, there's at least 6,000 members of the Campfire Firefighters Union, and that's the third biggest, I believe, firefighters union in the United States and the largest in California. And you see what this governor responds to, it's money. And maybe he likes the macho image or something, take charge, but he has a hard time thinking things through, in my opinion. But anyway, I just wanted to comment.
Yeah, right, thank you. Anyone else?
Rick, I'd like to point out that that the money in politics is not just a problem here, but a problem universally. And as a result, we have the Forest Practice Act, which sets up the Board of Forestry, which writes the rules for logging. By law, 3 of those members have to be from the timber industry. That's required. And 1 from the livestock grazing industry. And the rest can be, although they're supposedly, quote, public members, they actually end up usually as one of the members of the registered professional foresters, sometimes a banker that finances logging, and often consultants that work with the logging industry on an ongoing basis. So the whole system is set up for increased logging. And of course, Cal-Fire is funded in large measure from the fees for timber harvest plans. And then the other point I'd like to make is the developers usually have sway at the local level. And so trying to get measures that protect homes is difficult because the developers don't want to do that. It's too costly. It reduces their profit.
Yeah, good point, Rick. Let me just go through what the state's response is. There's 2 basic responses we've had. One, the Cal Fire Vegetation Treatment Program, and the other is this new Forest Resilient Action Plan that came out last month. So the VTP acknowledges treatments, and it's another Orwellian term here, will not stop the most devastating fires. And this stat is just mind-blowing to me. 9 out of the 16,000 plus fires in California during 2017 and 18 caused 95% of the damage. 9 fires. Cal Fire is ignoring those and focuses on the others. And they'll always bring up an example of how this fuel treatment did this fuel. It doesn't matter. We lost 80 plus people in Paradise. What's happening is it's not working. So it's hard for them to see this, but that's, the thing that needs to be addressed is why are you losing so many homes and lives? It's not about those fires you're treating and you're able to put out. It's the ones you can't do anything about. And you can't address it by trying to clear the natural environment, because that's not going to work either, because grass will cause the same dilemmas if that's what they want. And if anybody's from Texas or Oklahoma, you know about the 1 million plus fires they have there, and it's all grass, and they're pretty devastating. So the VTP targets about 250,000 acres of habitat a year for treatment. It acknowledges the threat, however, of too much fire in Chaparral, but it targets most Chaparral for more fire. So this, you know, they say the right things, but in action, they don't think you're going to catch them doing the wrong things. And it circumvents state law, because state law says you cannot cause type conversion or alteration of habitat, chaparral, sage-grouse. Well, the problem is there's no definition for type conversion in state law. So Cal Fire's redefined it in a way that allows them to do whatever they want. And that's something we're working on too. This forest resilience plan came out, and it mostly focuses on areas far from where most Californians are at risk. It targets 500,000 acres a year for clearance. And just so you know, California is about 100 million acres. So you can kind of pencil that out. It plans massive ecological disturbance in post-fire forest habitat. They want to go in, salvage log, and replant. They just can't leave things alone because they think these forests have been destroyed by these fires. Well, they haven't been. They really haven't been. And they acknowledge also that there's a threat to too much fire to chaparral, but they don't say anything about it. And you can take a look at this thing. It's on the website that they've got for the state. It's the type in the Forest Resilient Action Plan and read it. They have one sentence in there about chaparral, and the rest of it's about forests. Yet that's not where people are dying. So financially speaking, it's really follow the money, not what they say. In relation to logging and habitat clearance versus protecting communities, this is what I've heard from Gavin Newsom. This is what I've heard from Wade Crowfoot, the Secretary of Natural Resources, from lots of other people. It's not either, it's both. We're going to do both. Okay, that's what they say. And Governor Newsom said it in his speech the other day. Well, let's take a look at it. They've got $1 billion proposed. All right. 922 million of that is for habitat clearance. 56 million is for communities. I'm afraid to say, but it is either. And it's all focused on clearing habitat and logging forests. And just to let you know how this impacts us, this is an overhead view from Google Earth of Fountain Grove in Santa Rosa. And I just want you to look at the transition for a minute, because this is what happened after the Tubbs fire. Every single home was destroyed. Their forest logging and clearance would have had no impact on this whatsoever. I mean, these people lost their livelihoods, their lives, family members. And we're talking about almost 5% of the budget to address this issue. Yeah, it absolutely is flabbergasting to me. So I've got a couple solutions, and we put it in this letter that a lot of you know about and you signed, and I really am grateful for that. Number one and foremost, we have to value nature and protect what's left, and stop talking about fuel. We have to get this fuel-centric attitude out of the dialogue. It's about saving lives and property. That's the priority, and we've got to focus on communities. Then you can go out on the wild land and do some things maybe, but take care of the communities first. Secondly, you know, we want to focus on where and how people are dying and homes are burning, not the desires of vested interests. I know logging jobs are important, and biomass can produce energy as well as carbon inputs, but that's not what we need to focus on. Third, it's about flammable communities, drought, and wind. It's not about how many manzanitas you've got. That's just the basic story there. And what we have to do is we have to plan for what's predicted to happen, not repeat past mistakes. I talked to a member of the Board of Forestry about a year ago or so ago, and she told me that, you know, well, we don't have the problem in Northern California you have in Southern California with all these fires. Well, this is about 5 years ago. And I said, you know, you don't yet, but you will. And climate change is going to make it worse. And I couldn't get her to understand. But chaparral up here needs to burn. It's missing too many fire cycles. I said, okay, even though I don't agree with that, forget that for a moment. Think about the future. Well, the fire has visited Northern California over the last 5 years in ways that they never imagined. So we've got to look forward, not what we did in the past.